The boarding gate was busy, but Mariana felt like the stairs weighed more on her than on anyone else there. Maybe it was just in her head. Maybe it was the simple jeans, the unbranded blouse, the hair pulled back without much effort. It didn't matter. She tried to convince herself that no one here should care about that, but the quick glances and slightly curious expressions didn't help. It wasn't her first time flying, but it was her first time in business class, and honestly, she would have preferred economy. Fewer expectations, fewer judgments. But Ricardo had insisted. It was a gift for her tireless work on the charity event. "You deserve it," he had said. Now, standing there, gripping the ticket with slight tension in her fingers, Mariana wondered if deserving was enough. As the priority line started to move, she took a deep breath and walked toward the boarding area, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling creeping up her spine. But before she could take another step, the chief flight attendant, a woman with impeccable posture and a carefully neutral expression, extended a hand to stop her. "I think there's been a mistake, ma'am. This line is for business class passengers," she said in a tone that wasn't exactly rude, but carried a subtle impatience. Mariana blinked, caught off guard. For a moment, she thought she had misheard. "I know," she replied, showing her ticket. The attendant took the paper and examined it longer than necessary, furrowing her brow as if searching for an inconsistency. "I'll need to check in the system." "Could you wait a moment?" she said, making no effort to hide her suspicion. Mariana shifted her weight from one foot to the other, feeling the stairs prickling at her skin. The murmurs were subtle, almost imperceptible, but she knew they were there. The businessman standing a few steps away leaned slightly toward his wife and muttered, "It happens all the time. Some people think they can just blend in." His wife gave a tight, knowing smile and clutched her designer handbag a little closer, as if Mariana's presence alone was an intrusion. Minutes passed. Other passengers walked past without issue, their tickets barely glanced at, but Mariana remained standing there, waiting. She could feel the impatience growing in her chest, a slow, simmering burn. She wasn't causing a scene, she wasn't being rude, yet somehow, she was still being treated as an anomaly. "Excuse me," she finally said, keeping her voice steady, "but is there a problem?" Carla, the flight attendant, barely glanced up, exhaling as if this entire interaction was exhausting her. "Ma'am, we just need to ensure there's an appropriate seat for you," she replied, her words smooth but laced with something unmistakable. Not concern. Not protocol. Condescension. Mariana clenched her jaw, forcing herself to remain composed. She had dealt with condescending people before, but there was something uniquely humiliating about being treated like she was out of place, like she had wandered into a space that didn't belong to her. She could feel the judgment radiating from the people around her, their stolen glances saying what their lips didn't dare to. She must have made a mistake. She doesn't look like she flies business class. And yet, she had done nothing wrong. She had a ticket, she had followed the rules, and still, she was being forced to prove herself in a way that no one else was. Another couple walked past, their boarding passes barely checked, before they were waved through. Mariana's patience wore thinner. She took a breath, then another. "I bought this ticket. I deserve to be here just as much as anyone else," she said, her voice even, but firm. Carla's lips pressed into a thin line. It was a look Mariana had seen before, the look of someone who had already decided they were right and was simply tolerating an argument they believed was beneath them. Before Carla could respond, a shadow shifted in Mariana's peripheral vision. A man in a navy blue suit, carrying an expensive leather briefcase, glanced at the scene with mild interest. His gaze lingered on Mariana for a fraction too long before he turned to Carla. "Is there an issue?" he asked, not to her, but to the flight attendant, as if Mariana's presence in the line was a disturbance he hoped would be quickly resolved. Carla offered him a tight smile, a silent understanding passing between them. "We're just verifying a detail with this reservation," she said smoothly, as if Mariana's presence in the business class line was an anomaly that required official investigation. The man gave a small nod, then turned back to his wife, whispering something Mariana didn't catch. His wife chuckled softly, her gaze flicking to Mariana before she turned away, uninterested. Mariana could feel the heat creeping up her neck. Not from embarrassment, no, not anymore. It was something deeper, something angrier. This wasn't just about a boarding pass. It was about the unspoken rules. People like Carla and that businessman seemed to live by rules that decided who belonged and who didn't. The realization settled like a weight in her chest, heavier than she expected. She had spent her life working hard, giving her time and energy to causes that mattered, but in this moment, none of it seemed to count. All they saw was what she wasn't. She tightened her grip on her ticket. "How much longer will this take?" she asked, her voice steady, but her patience thinning. Carla let out a small sigh, as if she were the one being inconvenienced. "Just a moment more," she said, but there was no urgency in her tone. Mariana watched as more passengers breezed past her without so much as a second glance at their tickets. It was obvious now, this wasn't about verification. It was about making her wait. Making her question herself. Making her feel like she didn't belong. The weight of the situation pressed against Mariana's ribs, but she refused to let it sink her. She had spent too many years teaching children about self-worth, about standing up for themselves, to let a flight attendant and a handful of smug passengers dictate her place in the world. She lifted her chin slightly, grounding herself in that thought. "I'd like to speak to a supervisor," she said, her tone calm but unwavering. Carla's expression flickered, just for a second, but it was enough. A crack in the mask of authority she had been wearing. "Ma'am, I assure you, this is just a routine check," she said, though. The words felt empty now, like she knew Mariana wasn't buying it anymore. But before she could say anything else, the air around them shifted. A presence entered the space, one that made Carla straighten instinctively. Mariana didn't even have to turn around to know who it was. Ricardo's voice cut through the tension like a blade, calm, measured, but carrying a weight that immediately commanded attention. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his gaze flicking between Carla and Mariana. His presence alone shifted the dynamic. The murmurs quieted. The businessman who had been watching with amusement suddenly found something else to focus on. Carla's posture stiffened, but she recovered quickly, offering a polite but strained smile. "Sir, we were just verifying a small discrepancy with this passenger's reservation," she said, still holding Mariana's ticket in her hand like it was evidence in a case against her. Ricardo's eyes lingered on the ticket for a moment before settling back on Carla. "A discrepancy," he repeated, his tone light, almost conversational. "That's interesting. Because this passenger happens to be my wife." The shift in Carla's expression was almost imperceptible, but Mariana caught it. A flicker of realization, of discomfort, of understanding that this was no longer just an inconvenience she could brush aside. The quiet amusement that had lingered in the air moments ago was gone, replaced by something heavier. The businessman, the one who had whispered to his wife, suddenly wasn't watching anymore. His wife, who had clutched her designer handbag as if Mariana's mere presence was a threat, turned her head toward the window, pretending she wasn't a part of this. But Mariana noticed. She noticed everything. The way people only cared when power entered the room. The way their indifference crumbled the moment Ricardo revealed who he was. It was infuriating how easily respect was given when a name carried weight, yet before that, she had been nothing but an inconvenience, someone to be dealt with and dismissed. Ricardo took a step closer, his presence casting a shadow over the flimsy excuses Carla had been hiding behind. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "You're telling me that while every other passenger in this line boarded without issue, my wife, who has a perfectly valid business class ticket, was the only one stopped for a verification process?" His words were precise, deliberate, and Mariana could see the way. Carla's grip on the ticket tightened. A small, almost involuntary reaction, but one that betrayed her nerves. "Sir, we follow strict procedures to ensure the integrity of our boarding process," she said, her voice measured, but Mariana could hear the strain underneath. Ricardo's expression remained unreadable, but there was a sharpness in his eyes. "And tell me," he continued, "what part of those procedures requires my wife to be the only passenger subjected to this?" Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. The other passengers, who had been so quick to judge Mariana moments ago, now found themselves frozen, waiting for Carla to answer. But no answer came. Because there wasn't one. Carla's silence stretched on, the weight of it pressing down on the space between them. The energy in the room had shifted completely. What had started as a quiet humiliation for Mariana had now turned into something much larger, something undeniable. The passengers who had once stolen glances at her with thinly veiled amusement now avoided looking at her entirely. The businessman who had murmured about people who think they can blend in kept his gaze locked on the floor. Even Carla, who had moments ago exuded confidence and authority, seemed to shrink under Ricardo's scrutiny. Mariana, for the first time since this ordeal began, felt the balance of power shift. She wasn't just standing there, waiting for permission to exist in this space anymore. She was watching as the people who had judged her were now the ones caught in their own discomfort. Carla finally cleared her throat, her fingers tightening around the boarding pass. "There must have been a miscommunication," she said, her voice quieter now, the sharp edge of superiority gone. "I'll process her boarding immediately." The words were meant to smooth things over, to make the situation disappear, but it was too late for that. Ricardo didn't move. His posture remained relaxed, but there was a quiet authority in the way he looked at Carla, as if he was giving her one last chance to be honest. "A miscommunication," he repeated, his voice carrying the kind of weight that made people listen. Carla swallowed hard, clearly aware that her usual tactics wouldn't work this time. She hastily handed Mariana's ticket back, avoiding eye contact as she gestured toward the boarding gate. "You're free to board now," she said, but the damage had already been done. This wasn't about a delayed boarding process anymore. It was about the way she had been treated, the way she had been made to feel like an outsider in a place she had every right to be. Mariana took the ticket without a word, her fingers brushing against the paper as she steadied herself. She could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the lingering embarrassment on Carla's face, the passengers now pretending they hadn't been part of the silent judgment. She could have walked past them without saying anything. She could have let Ricardo handle it entirely. But something inside her wouldn't allow that. She turned back to Carla, holding her gaze. "You made an assumption about me," she said, her voice steady, not angry, just firm. "And that assumption was wrong." Carla's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to protest, but nothing came out. Because there was nothing to say. Mariana didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked toward the boarding gate, feeling the weight of every step. The humiliation hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something else, something sharper, more resolute. As she passed the businessman who had whispered about people trying to blend in, she saw him shift uncomfortably in his seat, his wife suddenly very interested in the contents of her phone. They weren't laughing now. No one was. The quiet satisfaction of proving them wrong should have felt like a victory, but it didn't. It only reminded her of how easily people judged based on appearances, how quickly they decided who belonged and who didn't. Ricardo walked beside her, his presence solid and unwavering. He didn't say anything right away, and she was grateful for that. The moment was hers to process. As they reached their seats in business class, she felt the same eyes that had dismissed her earlier now watching her again, but this time, with uncertainty, maybe even regret. She settled into her seat, exhaling slowly, letting the tension in her body release little by little. Ricardo finally spoke, his voice low but certain. "This isn't over," he said. "Not for them." Mariana turned to look at him, and in his eyes, she saw the same quiet determination she felt in herself. The flight attendants now moved with careful precision, their interactions with Mariana noticeably different. No more questioning glances, no more condescending tones, just overly polite smiles and a forced professionalism that felt almost rehearsed. It was the kind of treatment that only came after someone realized they had miscalculated. But Mariana wasn't interested in their apologies, silent or otherwise. The moment had already passed. She had seen their true colors. She had felt what it was like to be deemed unworthy until proven otherwise. And the worst part? This wasn't new. It had happened before. It would happen again. As the last passengers boarded and the flight attendants made their final checks, Carla moved hesitantly toward them. Her usual confidence had been replaced by something less certain, less composed. She stopped a few steps away, as if debating whether to speak. "I just want to say," she began, but Ricardo didn't let her finish. He turned his head slightly, his tone cool but final. "Not now," he said. Carla blinked, her mouth still slightly open, but she nodded once and stepped away. Mariana didn't need to hear whatever half-hearted excuse was about to follow. She had already heard enough. The flight took off smoothly, but Mariana barely noticed. She stared out the window, watching the city shrink beneath them, her thoughts still tangled in everything that had just happened. She knew she should let it go, leave it in the past, move on, but the feeling lingered. Not just the humiliation, but the deeper realization of how easily people dismissed others based on nothing but appearances. If Ricardo hadn't arrived when he did, how much longer would she have been standing there? Would they have denied her boarding altogether? She didn't even want to think about it. Ricardo reached over, gently resting a hand on hers. It was a small gesture, but it grounded her. She turned to face him, his expression calm but thoughtful. "You okay?" he asked. She hesitated before answering. "I don't know," she admitted. "I should be, but I'm not." Ricardo nodded as if he understood exactly what she meant. "You shouldn't have to prove yourself to anyone just to be treated with respect," he said, his voice low but firm. "That's the part that bothers me the most." Mariana exhaled slowly, knowing he was right. She had spent so much time working to lift others up, yet here she was, reminded of how easily people tried to push her down. Mariana leaned back in her seat, trying to shake off the weight of the experience, but it clung to her. She had spent years teaching children about fairness, about kindness, about standing up for what was right, yet in a matter of minutes, she had been reminded that the world didn't always play by those rules. The thought made her stomach tighten. She wasn't naive. She knew people like Carla existed, people who made silent judgments and acted on them without a second thought. But knowing it and feeling it were two different things. And today, she had felt it deeply. She glanced around the cabin, noticing how everyone had settled in as if nothing had happened. As if they hadn't just watched her be treated like she didn't belong. That was the part that stung the most, the silence. No one had spoken up. No one had questioned it. They had only watched. Some with mild amusement, others with indifference, waiting to see how it would unfold. And now, with Ricardo's presence shifting the power dynamic, they all pretended they hadn't been part of it. The hypocrisy of it made her chest tighten. She wasn't angry anymore. She was disappointed. As the flight attendants moved around the cabin, offering drinks and warm towels, Mariana noticed how careful they were now, how deliberate their kindness seemed. It wasn't genuine, it was damage control. And yet, none of them acknowledged what had just happened. Not one person had the courage to say, "We were wrong." They just smoothed over the moment, pretending it was never an issue to begin with. It was almost laughable. The same people who had questioned whether she belonged were now eager to serve her, to make her comfortable, as if that could erase the humiliation she had endured at the gate. She took a sip of water, her throat still tight. Ricardo hadn't spoken in a while, but his presence was reassuring. She knew him well enough to see that his mind was working, that he wasn't going to let this go. He had built his career by paying attention to the details others ignored, and right now, she could tell he was thinking about every single flaw in the system that had allowed this to happen. Finally, he exhaled and glanced at her. "We need to do something about this," he said, his tone decisive. Mariana met his gaze and, for the first time since the incident, she felt something other than frustration. She felt purpose. Mariana set her glass down, her fingers drumming lightly against the armrest as Ricardo's words settled in. "We need to do something about this." It wasn't just a passing remark. He meant it. And so did she. This wasn't just about her experience, it was about how many others had gone through the same thing, maybe worse, and had no one to step in for them. She thought about the countless people who had been made to feel small, who had been forced to prove themselves in spaces they had every right to occupy. That thought alone ignited something inside her, something she wasn't willing to ignore. Ricardo leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You remember that customer experience position we were talking about?" he asked. Mariana nodded, recalling the discussion they had before this trip. It was an open role at his company, meant to ensure that passengers were treated with dignity and fairness. "I think you'd be perfect for it," he continued. "You understand people, and you understand what's wrong with the system better than anyone sitting in those boardrooms." Mariana let out a short breath, considering it. She hadn't thought of herself in a corporate role before, but maybe this was exactly where she needed to be. Maybe real change started with people who had lived through the problem. Mariana looked out the window, watching the clouds stretch endlessly beneath them. She had spent her entire career focused on education, on shaping young minds to believe in fairness, respect, and integrity. But here, in this moment, she realized that no matter how much she taught those values, the real world still operated under a different set of rules, ones that needed to be challenged. Maybe she had been looking at it all wrong. Maybe the lesson wasn't just about teaching others how to be better, but about stepping into the spaces where change could actually happen. She turned back to Ricardo, her expression thoughtful. "You really think I could make a difference?" she asked. He didn't hesitate. "I know you could." And for the first time since the incident at the gate, Mariana felt something shift inside her. She had walked into that airport as someone who preferred to stay in the background, someone who avoided calling attention to herself. But now, she understood that sometimes, attention was necessary. Sometimes, you had to take up space, speak up, and demand the respect you deserved. The hum of the engines filled the quiet space between them, but Mariana's mind was anything but silent. She thought about the way people like Carla operated, confident in their assumptions, certain that no one would challenge them. And most of the time, no one did. That was the problem. People let things slide, they ignored the discomfort, they walked away instead of standing their ground. But what if someone didn't? What if, instead of letting it pass, she did something about it? The thought was both daunting and electrifying. She glanced around the cabin, noting how the same passengers who had watched her humiliation unfold were now pretending none of it had happened. It was easier that way, for them, at least. But not for her. Not anymore. Ricardo was right. If she stayed silent, she'd be just another person letting it happen, another person making it easier for the next Carla to do the same thing to someone else. Mariana wasn't sure what she would do next, but she knew one thing: she wasn't going to be silent. Not anymore. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering refills and adjusting trays, Mariana observed them with a new perspective. She wasn't looking for apologies anymore, she knew they wouldn't come. But she was looking at how easily the world smoothed over its own discomfort, how people who had played a role in someone's humiliation could pretend it had never happened the moment it became inconvenient. It wasn't just Carla. It was the system that allowed people like her to act without consequence. Knowing most passengers wouldn't push back, Ricardo tapped lightly on the armrest, breaking her thoughts. "When we land, let's set up a meeting," he said simply. Mariana raised an eyebrow. "A meeting," she repeated. He nodded. "With the customer service and training teams. If we're serious about fixing this, we start there." Mariana let the idea settle in. A few hours ago, she would have never considered herself someone who could take on a role like that. But now, it felt obvious. Necessary. She gave a small nod. "All right," she said. "Let's do it." The announcement came over the speakers, signaling their descent. Mariana fastened her seatbelt, but her mind was already ahead, thinking about what would come next, about what this moment meant beyond just her own experience. The version of herself that had walked into that airport, hesitant to even accept a business class ticket, felt distant now. She had let people's perceptions define her for too long. That was over. She wasn't here because someone allowed her to be. She was here because she belonged. And she would make sure no one else had to fight for the same recognition. As the plane touched down, she felt a deep sense of finality, not just to the flight, but to the version of herself that had hesitated, that had doubted whether she should take up space. Ricardo squeezed her hand briefly, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had just been through. When they stood to leave, she noticed Carla standing near the exit, her expression unreadable. But Mariana didn't pause. She walked past her with quiet confidence, stepping off the plane not as someone who had been put in her place, but as someone who had found it. The airport terminal bustled with travelers, but Mariana moved through the crowd with a different energy now. The weight of what had happened didn't disappear the moment she stepped off the plane, but it no longer sat heavy on her shoulders, it fueled her. This wasn't just about one flight, one gate, agent, or one moment of humiliation. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong, who had been forced to prove their worth in places where no one else had to. She couldn't change the past, but she could change what came next. As they reached the baggage claim, Ricardo turned to her with a knowing look. "You're already thinking about how to fix this, aren't you?" he asked. Mariana exhaled, a small smile forming at the corner of her lips. I am, she admitted. Because this wasn't just about proving a point, it was about making sure no one else had to stand at a boarding gate, holding their dignity like a fragile thing, waiting for someone else to decide if they deserved to be there. That day, Mariana didn't just reclaim her seat on a flight. She reclaimed her voice. And she had no intention of staying silent ever again.